I propose, from a military point of view, to purely technically consider the situation of a future truce, which will take place over 3 days. Let's compare it with what we already have as some successful examples. Well, successful. This is a somewhat fluid concept in this context. I am specifically referring to the Easter truce and what happened there. We transfer the experience. It's already gained to what will happen over these 3 days. And perhaps we will understand what awaits us next.
Well, actually, I was just analyzing the issue of truces and ceasefires today, those that we had with Russia, or rather, those we didn't have. De facto, de jure, they were proclaimed, but de facto, they never actually happened. Since 2014, from the time it essentially began, of the Russian-Ukrainian war, which began with the annexation followed by the occupation of Crimea. And we have the most, well, let's say, effective experience that could be called when a real ceasefire was established there. It lasted, well, for 2 days during the entire time. In principle, when everything was happening in the rest of the area, one way or another, sometimes with greater intensity, sometimes with less intensity, but at the same time, the ceasefire was violated due to the fault of the Russian side and the formations created by Russia. The military formations of the so-called DNR and LNR, which Russia created and supported. So, in fact, this is regarding the chronology, regarding the facts. Approaching the time of the full-scale invasion, we have a case where Russia unilaterally declared a ceasefire, the so-called Easter truce, announcing Ukraine, based on the consistency of our position that Ukraine does not object, the Ukrainian state against establishing a ceasefire took this step, responding that where the enemy will not act and where the enemy will not attack, we will not attack, but where the enemy strikes, certainly the armed forces of Ukraine will retaliate, and this is absolutely understandable. This experience showed that it was possible to record for a certain period of time, somewhere for an hour, somewhere for 2, somewhere for 3, somewhere for several hours. In certain sections of the front, there was a decrease in the intensity of enemy fire. It was possible to record that in certain sections, minor section, but of the front, there was even a certain regime of silence. But in most sections, there were recorded shellings by Russian troops, assault actions, the use of drones, artillery, and so on. The only thing that can be stated is that where a regime of silence occurred, which lasted for a day, was in the air. Indeed, during this period, Russia did not launch long-range drones. I emphasize long-range. Because along the line of combat engagement, they launched their drones both on fiber optics and others. But drones like Shahed or ballistic missiles or cruise missiles, which strike our cities causing terrorist attacks, Russia did not carry out. Thus, Ukraine and the president of Ukraine proposed as a result of this resistance a ceasefire which never took place. On Easter, when he proposed that we hold on to what worked for us and extend the ceasefire in the sky, to which the Kremlin essentially responded with a refusal and continued to carry out its criminal terrorist attacks on the territory of Ukraine. Now, once again, Ukraine, as the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, Andriy Sybiha, absolutely correctly and clearly stated, thank you. Why do you want to do this? From the beginning of the day, May 8th, let's do it from May 1st. Let's do it right now. Ukraine is open and Ukraine proposed this. There is no need to undermine Ukrainian proposals trying to nullify them. And as a result of such actual scams, frauds, manipulations, trying to present it to the Kremlin and Putin in such a way that supposedly these are their proposals, and they are in principle responsible for them, claiming that it is the Kremlin, such a great peacemaker, who wants to establish a ceasefire. So, this is what we have today. An experience that, of course, leaves us with no naivety or false hopes. That, well, let's say what to expect from the Kremlin, and that we do not expect a complete and unconditional ceasefire without any violations. But for what purpose? That is why, by the way, Ukraine comes forward with proposals, because we are not just talking. We are not setting any ultimatums and so on. We are not saying, like Putin, that we are stopping the fire unilaterally, and you do the same. Firstly, we cannot do this because we understand that Russia may continue to attack, and this poses great risk for us. And we propose the following algorithm, that the ceasefire should be documented in the relevant agreements. An agreement should be concluded, in which the role of intermediaries, observers, and monitors for this ceasefire will be defined. That is, we want it to be documented that our European partners and the USA will conduct round-the-clock monitoring along the line of combat engagement, the movement of Russian ballistic missiles, rockets, and the possible arming of their aircraft, monitoring the movement of their personnel and equipment, which may indicate preparations for assault actions. That is, satellites need to be operational. Technical intelligence must be active, and surveillance cameras along the line of combat engagement. Similarly, observation missions that should be located at various sections of the front. And this must be at least recorded to be clearly documented. Thank you. Who is the initiator of the ceasefire violation? That it is the Kremlin. Otherwise, well, this is a story that can go on indefinitely, where Russia essentially creates, that is, they unilaterally propose a truce. Ukraine agrees, as was the case, for example, during Easter. Then Russia breaks its own truce, they violate it and try to blame Ukraine, claiming that the Kremlin is like this. So they came out with peacekeeping initiatives. Why doesn't official Kiev support it? But I can tell you. Again, analyzing the experience, that was. And I saw a clear picture of the monitoring of the information space of Western media following the so-called Easter truce. And I have to say that the Kremlin scheme failed because the vast majority, more than 2/3 of European and American media, not only them, but also outlets like Al Jazeera and others, they wrote about it. Well, roughly speaking, that Russia violated its own declared truce, meaning from the perspective of an information campaign, trying to throw. Well, let's say to create some unfavorable background and put in such a bad position, noting that supposedly Ukraine is not adhering to some conditions. I think the Kremlin won't succeed anymore. But what they are trying to do in this way is to demonstrate the illusory nature of the negotiation process, a facade behind which they are hiding, saying that supposedly we are striving for a negotiation process, offering some initiatives for a ceasefire and so on. That is, of course, Russia will fully utilize this in its information and propaganda campaign.
Let's also analyze the situation when the Russians have been striking from the air for these 3 days. Well, so to speak, we can't strike from the air. We have a situation where modern warfare, in which drones are used, has completely changed the art of this war. It has greatly transformed the art of this war. So, FPV is difficult to track, but I think our partners will definitely be monitoring any launches, any missiles. So the question is how much the enemy will succeed. If they strike from the air, they won't be able to do so for these 3 days.
Well, actually, we need to understand that today we are well aware that Russia is not restricted. That is to say, they themselves, come up with a story and are ready to act as their own mediator. As you know, there is such a story in principle based on real events when Russians are fighting somewhere in a factory and the foreman comes by and says, "What are you doing?" And they say, "No, don't touch, boss. We'll fight ourselves. We'll sort it out ourselves." Well, it's roughly the same situation. That is, we perfectly understand they make up for themselves. The concept of this so-called ceasefire, they regulate the modalities and possibilities for themselves. They determine for themselves how to act, in which directions there might indeed be silence, and in which it will be absent. And, of course, if we are talking about drones, especially along the line of combat contact, it cannot be ruled out that the enemy will use them. At least, During the so-called Easter truce, the use of drones along the front line was by Russian forces. The states were not involved this time, but we must understand that Shaheds are used by Russia, including for military purposes. Moreover, it can now be observed that these drones are increasingly being used against civilian populations as well, and our civilian infrastructure. We see the situation that arose after the Russian strikes on the city of Cherkasy and the reports from local authorities and the mayor of Cherkasy. Bondarenko from there mentioned issues with gas supply and so on. But in fact, the Kremlin is striking our economic infrastructure. We saw in the Dnipropetrovsk region, they struck an agricultural facility. And not only that, that is, they also aim to weaken our economic potential. Agricultural in particular, judging by the official reports from the regional military administrations that we have. Therefore, from the perspective of the Shaheds, they fulfill the role needed in terms of strikes, but not from the front line's perspective. Because in principle, when we talk about the line of combat engagement, it is clear that at least for now, what can be stated is that the enemy, once again, is bringing more artillery systems to the front line. They are being destroyed in large numbers. I can say that by the end of March, we might have a new record for the number of enemy artillery systems destroyed. In reality, they are being destroyed in huge numbers, but Russia still brings them in, including North Korean systems, and actively uses drones. We understand perfectly why. We understand that they are being destroyed, but will Russia voluntarily withdraw them? May 8-9, I have my doubts. Therefore, the risks of shelling, such as with FPV drones, fiber optic drones, which Russia is scaling up, and this is also a challenge for us in terms of our defense. All of this will remain, and the risks and signs that the enemy might use this, even during the so-called ceasefire, these risks persist.
We are currently observing a change in Trump's rhetoric. He is starting to, so to speak, very gently, but still criticize Putin and show some dissatisfaction. Previously, we didn't see anything like this at all. I'm leading to the point that, after all, Putin, who has been leading Trump on, is starting to show its effects, and Trump is beginning to struggle with this issue. And is there such a realistic scenario? A highly likely one, where Trump finally gets fed up. With this whole story, he simply provides Ukraine with weapons, as much as needed.
This is one of the possible scenarios for the development of events. We need to understand that for us, many things serve as an indicator. May 9th, I have previously mentioned this as well, because many things are tied to it. So we need to understand that on May 9th, two scenarios for the development of events are possible. First, it is that Putin might suddenly say that he is ready to truly agree to a ceasefire, and supposedly Russia is winning this war, and supposedly it can be concluded because the goals are being achieved, and the USA agrees with Russia on many points, and together they supposedly force Ukraine to make some concessions. In other words, Russian propaganda will find a way to present it. In fact, they know how to wrap this rotten structure and concept in a beautiful package. By the way, this fake announcement is disinformation from the Russian command and Putin. The claim that the operation of Russian troops in the Kursk region has supposedly been successfully completed may indicate a certain preparatory stage for what I'm talking about, to announce a ceasefire. Well, and to say that here, there are supposedly no Ukrainian troops on Russian territory. So this is one of the scenarios, and the second scenario is that everything will end as it did during the so-called Easter truce. And once again, there will be another round of diplomatic consultations, which of course may disappoint the American president. And undoubtedly he may take such steps as effectively halting the negotiation process. Because if we follow the logic and words of the US Secretary of State Max Rubio, who said in his Sunday interview to an American television channel that the US is not imposing more severe sanctions because it could mean the end of diplomacy. In other words, he indicated that it is possible, but it could be a last resort. And based on President Trump's message that he posted on Saturday, April 26th, on the social network Truth Social, it can be said that he is already half a step away. Trump is close to making such a decision to impose sanctions, but the indicator, May October 9th. You see how are the links. Graham, a close associate of Trump, close to Donald Trump. The Republican senator immediately announced on April 26th that he already has 60 co-authors for the bill on strengthening sanctions against Russia. 60 co-authors means 60 senators. That's the majority of the Senate of the United States of America, where 51 votes are needed to achieve a majority, at least in the upper house of Congress. And besides, I would like to point out what else might be pushing Donald Trump towards certain decisions. These are two sociological surveys that appeared recently in the USA. One of these surveys, conducted by the company Post Ipsos, commissioned by the Reuters agency, indicates that 59% of respondents, including, by the way, a third of Republican Party supporters, stated that, in their opinion, America is losing its authority on the world stage. That is 59% of Americans. And CNN conducted a survey, and they actually, in this survey, that 55 means, for them, 60% disapprove of U.S. foreign policy and believe that America appears weak on the international stage. Well, and there are two more factors that also have an impact. Well, the second factor that has an impact, today you probably saw this, the statement by Republican Senator John Kennedy. On the Fox Newsmax channel, he said that Russia should be hit hard with sanctions. And in fact, they should turn Russia into fish food so that Putin respects. And earlier, this weekend, on the right conservative American channel Newsmax, which received accreditation and full approval from Donald Trump at the White House, one of his favorite media outlets, now. Newsmax aired an interview with Republican Senator Chuck Graham, who said, live on this channel that Putin is playing with America like with some incapable, kid, not a world leader. This is an argument that ultimately will also influence the position of the U.S. president. Because if senators, Iowa is a small state, but it is very important in terms of the upcoming midterm elections. The Senate, and it must be understood that no matter what, Republicans need to continue to run for both houses of Congress. And they monitor sociological surveys, they keep an eye on voter reactions. And when senators from the states start to broadcast a certain position, they will never do it if this viewpoint does not align with or is in categorical opposition to the position of their voters. Yes, it doesn't work in America. Therefore, I think there are certain factors that will still serve as, let's say, an additional element and argumentation for President Trump why it is necessary to be more decisive towards Russia. But at the same time, this does not mean that we will see every speech by Trump or every post on social media as anti-Russian. No. They can be either neutral or sometimes even with jabs towards Ukraine. We are used to this as well. But at the same time, at some point, Trump might indeed make such a post, which he did on Saturday, and then proceed to a vote in the Senate to strengthen sanctions against Russia. And the vote, by the way, in Congress is a very serious element. These sanctions are very difficult to repeal later, because a repeat vote is required. Well, and this can last for a very long time, so it's a serious element of pressure on Putin, even the threat itself. The passage of the corresponding decision in Congress to strengthen sanctions.
Here's a question. Is Putin even afraid to end the war? Maybe there are some trigger points through which he could just give the order and say, that's it. It's over. He can't. So yes, he's being cautious, making such a, let's call it a breaking path where it's not abrupt, but just a little. He reduced speed for the Easter truce and then reduced speed a bit more for May 9th. And what exactly prevents him, Tranta, from saying after these 3 days, well, that's it now? It's definitely the end?
You see, it all depends on, let's say, on how the situation unfolds for him. We must understand that we should consider the position, for example, of the Kremlin. It's a very ungrateful task. I understand being in the shoes of the enemy, especially such a terrorist, but let's look from their point of view. Look, those plans, the projects of plans, at least those that were in the media like Reuters and others that showed them, that this is supposedly a proposal from the USA, to which there were counter proposals from Ukraine and our European partners. But the US proposals show that, for example, Russia might see the lifting of sanctions imposed since 2014. By the way, this is also what Putin himself demands. These are the published demands voiced by Lavrov. So is this important to them? Of course it's important because data from a research center close to the Kremlin shows that by the end of 2025, the Russian economy is heading into an abyss, into a recession. So it's necessary to improve the economic situation. Secondly, the states are proposing the restoration of economic cooperation and collaboration in the energy sector. This is also important for the Russian economy. And Dmitriev, Putin's special representative, it seems, only traveled to the USA for this track, and he is negotiating only about this, specifically about rare earth metals and minerals. He does not hide this and has given interviews about it to both Russian and American media. That is, it is obvious that there are serious economic opportunities that the Kremlin, well, for the Kremlin, this is a big chance if you think from their perspective, which might not be there tomorrow. Tomorrow, Trump might make an impulsive decision and say, that's it. And the doors close and no, there are no relaxed concessions. For the Kremlin, there's no need to go. That's it. And the next thing is that after all, well, let's say, what is being offered to Russia, Ukraine not joining NATO, other statements, this is something the Kremlin can take as a victory flag, as if to say, look, we achieved this, and so on and so on. How the USA has heard us, wants to have us as a serious economic partner, and so on. We will now live better, and so on. On the other hand, if Russia, Putin, categorically rejects all gestures from the USA, then again, I repeat, Trump might get tired of it, and that's it. And Putin gets nothing. And then he continues the war with uncertain results for himself, because yes, they are conducting offensive actions, but we see that there are no strategic or operational successes. Yes, it's a war of attrition. Yes, it's undoubtedly difficult for us as well. The longer the war lasts, that's obvious. But still, it can continue in such a phase, and it may turn out that Europe will support Ukraine. And the United States will eventually understand that there is simply no other way, that it's impossible to negotiate with Putin. We need to, frankly, we need to wait and hope that someone might come, well, at least someone a little more adequate in Russia, as much as that's possible, with whom these things can be agreed upon. And therefore for Russia, for Putin, there is actually a lot at stake. Actually, Trab. To admit that, unfortunately, the USA is currently offering quite a lot to Russia. And I somewhat think that perhaps they didn't even expect to be offered exactly this. So the fact that they are now showing their bravado, as if arrogance, cynicism, this, excuse the word, show off, but it best demonstrates this Russian word. Now, the position Russian, well, that's okay. But it must be understood that, well, let's say, how long will this last? And what will they do if President Trump starts changing his position?
Mr. Alexander, thank you for this conversation. Thank you for joining us. It was truly informative, and we hope that everything will go as well as possible. One way or another, we are now at a point where a certain breakthrough might occur in favor of Ukraine and not at Ukraine's expense. Thank you. Thanks.